Down and Out in Paris and London, Chapter 10, by George Orwell. The Hotel X was a vast, grandiose place with a classical facade, and at one side a little dark doorway like a rat hole, which was the service entrance. I arrived at 7:15 in the morning. A stream of men with greasy trousers were hurrying in and being checked by a doorkeeper, who sat in a tiny office. I waited. And presently the chef du personnel, a sort of assistant manager, arrived and began to question me. He was an Italian with a round, pale face, haggard from overwork. He asked whether I was an experienced dishwasher, and I said that I was. He glanced at my hands and saw that I was lying, but on hearing that I was an Englishman, he changed his tone and engaged me. "We have been looking for someone to practice our English on," he said. "Our clients are all Americans, and the only English we know is—" He repeated something that little boys write on the walls in London. "You may be useful. Come downstairs." He led me down a winding staircase into a narrow passage, deep underground, and so low that I had to stoop in places. It was stiflingly hot and very dark, with only dim yellow bulbs several yards apart. There seemed to be miles of dark, labyrinthine passages, actually, I suppose, a few hundred yards in all, that reminded one queerly of the lower decks of a liner. There were the same heat and cramped space and warm reek of food and a humming, whirring noise. It came from the kitchen furnaces, just like the whir of engines. We passed doorways which let out sometimes a shouting of oaths, sometimes the red glare of a fire, once a shuddering draught from an ice chamber. As we went along, something struck me violently in the back. It was a 100-pound block of ice carried by a blue-aproned porter. After him came a boy with a great slab of veal on his shoulder, his cheek pressed into the damp, spongy flesh. They shoved me aside with a cry of "Sauve-toi, idiot!" and rushed on. On the wall, under one of the lights, someone had written in a very neat hand, "Sooner will you find a cloudless sky in winter than a woman at the Hotel X who has her maidenhead." It seemed a queer sort of place. One of the passages branched off into a laundry, where an old skull-faced woman gave me a blue apron and a pile of dishcloths. Then the chef du personnel took me to a tiny underground den, a cellar below a cellar, as it were, where there were a sink and some gas ovens. It was too low for me to stand quite upright, and the temperature was perhaps 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The chef du personnel explained that my job was to fetch meals for the higher hotel employees, who fed in a small dining room above, cleaned their room, and washed their crockery. When he had gone, a waiter, another Italian, thrust a fierce, fuzzy head into the doorway and looked down at me. "English, eh?" he said. "Well, I'm in charge here. If you work well," he made the motion of upending a bottle and sucking noisily. "If you don't," he gave the doorpost several vigorous kicks. "To me, twisting your neck would be no more than spitting on the floor. And if there's any trouble, they'll believe me, not you. So be careful." After this, I set to work rather hurriedly. Except for about an hour, I was at work from 7 in the morning till 9:15 at night. First at washing crockery, then at scrubbing the tables and floors of the employees' dining room, then at polishing glasses and knives, then at fetching meals, then at washing crockery again, then at fetching more meals and washing more crockery. It was easy work, and I got on well with it, except when I went to the kitchen to fetch meals. The kitchen was like nothing I had ever seen or imagined, a stifling, low-ceilinged inferno of a cellar, red-lit from the fires, and deafening with oaths and the clanging of pots and pans. It was so hot that all the metalwork, except the stoves, had to be covered with cloth. In the middle were furnaces, where 12 cooks skipped to and fro, their faces dripping sweat in spite of their white caps. Round that were counters were a mob of waiters and plongeurs, clamored with trays. Scullions, naked to the waist, were stoking the fires and scouring huge copper saucepans with sand. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry and a rage. The head cook, a fine scarlet man with big mustachios, stood in the middle, booming continuously. Ça marche! Deux œufs brûlés! Ça marche! Un chateaubriand aux pommes sautées! Except when he broke off to curse at a plongeur. There were 3 counters, and the first time I went to the kitchen, I took my tray unknowingly to the wrong one. The head cook walked up to me, twisted his mustaches, and looked me up and down. Then he beckoned to the breakfast cook and pointed at me. Did you see that? That is the type of plongeur they send us nowadays. Where do you come from, idiot? From Charenton, I suppose. There's a large lunatic asylum at Charenton. From England, I said. I might have known it well, mon cher monsieur l'anglais. May I inform you that you are the son of a whore? And now, the cup and to the other counter where you belong. I got this kind of reception every time I went to the kitchen, for I always made some mistake. I was expected to know the work and was cursed accordingly. From curiosity, I counted the number of times I was called macro during the day, and it was 39. At 4:30, the Italian told me that I could stop working, but that it was not worth going out as we began at 5. I went to the lavatory for a smoke. Smoking was strictly forbidden, and Boris had warned me that the lavatory was the only safe place. After that, I worked again till 9:15, when the waiter put his head into the doorway and told me to leave the rest of the crockery. To my astonishment, after calling me pig, mackerel, etc. all day, he had suddenly grown quite friendly. I realized that the curses that I had met with were only a kind of probation. That'll do, mon petit, said the man. Tu n'es pas débrouillard, but you work all right. Come and have your dinner. The hotel allows us 2 liters of wine each, and I've stolen another bottle. We'll have a fine booze. We had an excellent dinner from the leavings of the higher employees. The waiter, grown mellow, told me stories about his love affairs, and about 2 men whom he had stabbed in Italy, and about how he had dodged his military service. He was a good fellow when one got to know him. He reminded me of Benvenuto Cellini somehow. I was tired and drenched with sweat, but I felt a new man after a day's solid food. The work did not seem difficult, and I felt that this job would suit me. It was not certain, however, that it would continue, for I had been engaged as an extra for the day only, at 25 francs. The sour-faced doorkeeper counted out the money, less 50 centimes, which he said was for insurance. A lie, I discovered afterwards. Then he stepped out into the passage, made me take off my coat, and carefully prodded me all over, searching for stolen food. After this, the chef du personnel appeared and spoke to me like the waiter. He had grown more genial on seeing that I was willing to work. We will give you a permanent job if you like, he said. The head waiter says he would enjoy calling an Englishman names. Will you sign on for a month? Here was a job at last, and I was ready to jump at it. Then I remembered the Russian restaurant, due to open in a fortnight. It seemed hardly fair to promise working a month and then leave in the middle. I said that I had other work in prospect. Could I be engaged for a fortnight? But at that, the chef du personnel shrugged his shoulders and said that the hotel only engaged men by the month. Evidently, I had lost my chance of a job. Boris, by arrangement, was waiting for me in the arcade of the Rue de Rivoli. When I told him what happened, he was furious. For the first time since I had known him, he forgot his manners and called me a fool. Idiot, species of idiot. What the good of my finding you a job when you go and chuck it up the next moment? How could you be such a fool to mention the other restaurant? You don't need to promise you would work for a month. It seemed more honest to say I might have to leave, I objected. Honest, honest. Who ever heard of a plancher being honest? Mon ami. Suddenly he seized my lapel and spoke very earnestly. Mon ami, you have worked here all day. You see what hotel work is like. Do you think a plongeur can afford a sense of honor? No, perhaps not. Well, then, go back quickly and tell the chef du personnel you are quite ready to work for a month. Say you will throw the other job over. Then, when our restaurant opens, we have only to walk out. But what about my wages if I break my contract? Boris banged his stick on the pavement and cried out at such stupidity. Ask to be paid by the day, then you won't lose a sou. Do you suppose they would prosecute a plongeur for taking or breaking his contract? A plongeur is too low to be prosecuted. I hurried back, found the chef du personnel, and told him that I would work for a month, whereat he signed me on. This was my first lesson in plongeur morality. Later, I realized how foolish it had been to have any scruples, for the big hotels are quite merciless towards their employees. They engage or discharge men as the work demands, and they all sack 10% or more of their staff when the season is over. Nor have they any difficulty in replacing a man who leaves at short notice, for Paris is thronged by hotel employees out of work. Chapter 11. As it turned out, I did not break my contract, for it was 6 weeks before the Auberge de Giron Cotard even showed signs of opening. In the meantime, I worked at the Hotel X, 4 days a week in the cafeteria, one day helping the waiter on the fourth floor, and one day replacing the woman who washed up for the dining room. My day off, luckily, was Sunday, but sometimes another man was ill and I had to work that day as well. The hours were from 7 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, and from 5 in the evening till 9. 11 hours. But it was a 14-hour day when I washed up for the dining room. By the ordinary standards of a Paris plongeur, these are exceptionally short hours. The only hardship of life was the fearful heat and stuffiness of these labyrinthine cellars. Apart from this, the hotel, which was large and well organized, was considered a comfortable one. Our cafeteria was a murky cellar measuring 20 feet by 7 by 8 high, and so crowded with coffee urns, bread cutters, and the like that one could hardly move without banging against something. It was lighted by one dim electric bulb and 4 or 5 gas fires that sent out a fierce red breath. There was a thermometer there, and the temperature never fell below 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It neared 130 at some time of the day. At one end were 5 service lifts. At the other, an ice cupboard where we stored milk and butter. When you went into the ice cupboard, you dropped 100 degrees of temperature at a single step. It used to remind me of the hymn from Greenland's icy mountains and India's Coral Strand. 2 men worked in the cafeteria, besides Boris and myself. One was Mario, a huge, excitable Italian. He was like a city policeman with operatic gestures. And the other, a hairy, uncouth animal whom we called Magar. I think he was a Transylvanian or something even more remote. Except the Magar, we were all big men, and at the rush hours we collided incessantly. The work in the cafeteria was spasmodic. We were never idle, but the real work only came in bursts of 2 hours at a time. We called each burst un coup de feu. The first coup de feu at 8, when the guests upstairs began to wake up and demand breakfast. At 8, a sudden banging and yelling would break out all through the basement. Bells rang on all sides. Blue-aproned men rushed through the passages. Our service lifts came down with a simultaneous crash, and the waiters on all 5 floors began shouting Italian oaths down the shafts. I don't remember all our duties. They included making tea, coffee and chocolate, fetching meals from the kitchen, wines from the cellar, and fruit and so forth from the dining room, slicing bread, making toast, rolling pats of butter, measuring jam, opening milk cans, counting lumps of sugar, boiling eggs, cooking porridge, pounding ice, grinding coffee, all this for from 100 to 200 customers. The kitchen was 30 yards away and the dining room 60 or 70 yards. Everything we sent up in the service lifts had to be covered by a voucher, and the vouchers had to be carefully filed. And there was trouble if even a lump of sugar was lost. Besides this, we had to supply the staff with bread and coffee and fetch the meals for the waiters upstairs. All in all, it was a complicated job. I calculated that one had to walk and run about 15 miles during the day, and yet the strain of the work was more mental than physical. Nothing could be easier on the face of it than this stupid scullion work, but it is astonishingly hard when one is in a hurry. One has to leap to and fro between a multitude of jobs. It is like sorting a pack of cards against the clock. You are, for example, making toast when bang! Down comes a service lift with an order for tea, rolls, and three different kinds of jam, and simultaneously, bang! Down comes another demanding scrambled eggs, coffee, and grapefruit. You have to run to the kitchen for the eggs and to the dining room for the fruit, going like lightning so as to be back before your toast burns. And having to remember about the tea and coffee besides a half dozen other orders that are still pending. And at the same time, some waiter is following you and making trouble about a lost bottle of soda water, and you're arguing with him. It needs more brains than one might think. Mario said, no doubt truly, that it took a year to make a reliable cafetiere. The time between 8 and half past 10 was a sort of delirium. Sometimes we were going as though we had only 5 minutes to live. Sometimes there were sudden lulls when the order stopped and everything seemed quiet for a moment. Then we swept up the litter from the floor, threw down fresh sawdust, and swallowed gallipots of wine or coffee or water, anything, so long as it was wet. Very often we used to break off chunks of ice and suck them while we worked. The heat from the gas fires was nauseating. We swallowed quarts of drink during the day, and after a few hours, even our aprons were drenched with sweat. At times we were hopelessly behind with the work, and some of the customers would have gone without their breakfast, but Mario always pulled us through. He had worked 14 years in the cafeteria, and he had the skill that never wastes a second between jobs. The Magar was very stupid, and I was inexperienced, and Boris was inclined to shirk, partly because of his lame leg, partly because he was ashamed of working in the cafeteria after being a waiter. But Mario was wonderful. The way he would stretch his great arms right across the cafeteria to fill a coffee pot with one hand and boil an egg with the other, at the same time watching toast, shouting directions to the Magar, and between whiles singing snatches from Rigoletto, was beyond all praise. The patron knew his value, and he was paid 1,000 francs a month instead of the 500 like the rest of us. The breakfast pandemonium stopped at 10:30. Then we scrubbed the cafeteria tables, swept the floor, and polished the brasswork, and on good mornings, went one at a time to the lavatory for a smoke. This was our slack time. Only relatively slack, however, for we had only 10 minutes for lunch, and we never got through it uninterrupted. The customers' luncheon hour between 12 and 2 was another period of turmoil like the breakfast hour. Most of our work was fetching meals from the kitchen, which meant constant engueulades from the cooks. By this time, the cooks had sweated in front of their furnaces for 4 or 5 hours, and their tempers were all warmed up. At 2, we were suddenly free men. We threw off our aprons and put on our coats, hurried out of the doors, and when we had money, dived into the nearest bistro. It was strange, coming up into the street from those firelit cellars. The air seemed blindingly clear and cold, like Arctic summer, and how sweet the petrol did smell after the stenches of sweat and food. Sometimes we met some of our cooks and waiters in the bistros, and they were friendly and stood us drinks. Indoors, we were their slaves. But it is an etiquette in hotel life that between hours everyone is equal, and the engueulades do not count. At 4:45, we went back to the hotel. Till 6:30, there were no orders, and we used this time to polish silver, clean out the coffee urns, and do other odd jobs. Then the grand turmoil of the day started, the dinner hour. I wish I could be Zola for a little while just to describe that dinner hour. The essence of the situation was that 100 or 200 people were demanding individually different meals of 5 or 6 courses, and that 50 or 60 people had to cook and serve them and clean up the mess afterwards. Anyone with experience of catering will know what that means. And at this time, when the work was doubled, the whole staff was tired out, and a number of them were drunk. I could write pages about the scene without giving a true idea of it. The chargings to and fro in the narrow passages, the collisions, the yells, the struggling with crates and trays and blocks of ice, the heat, the darkness, the furious, festering quarrels, which there was no time to fight out. They passed description. Anyone coming into the basement for the first time would have thought himself in a den of maniacs. It was only later, when I understood the working of a hotel, that I saw order in all this chaos. At 8:30, the work stopped, very suddenly. We were not free till 9, but we used to throw ourselves full length on the floor and lie there, resting our legs, too lazy even to go to the ice cupboard for a drink. Sometimes the chef du personnel would come in with bottles of beer, for the hotel stood us an extra beer when we had had a hard day. The food we were given was no more than eatable, but the patron was not mean about drink. He allowed us 2 liters of wine a day each, knowing that if a plongeur is not given 2 liters, he will steal 3. We had the heel taps of bottles as well, so that we often drank too much. A good thing, for one seemed to work faster when partially drunk. 4 hours of the week passed like this. Of the other 2 working days, one was better and one worse. After a week of this life, I felt in need of a holiday. It was Saturday night, so the people in our bistro were getting drunk, and with a free day ahead of me, I was ready to join them. We all went to bed, drunk, at 2 in the morning, meaning to sleep till noon. At 5:30, I was suddenly awakened. A night watchman sent from the hotel was standing at my bedside. He stripped the clothes back and shook me roughly. Get up, he said. Tu t'es bien salut le nu, eh? Well, never mind that. The hotel's a man short. You've got to work today. Why should I work? I protested. This is my day off. Day off. Nothing. The work's got to be done. Get up. I got up and went out, feeling as though my back were broken and my skull filled with hot cinders. I did not think that I could possibly do a day's work, and yet, after only an hour in the basement, I found that I was perfectly well. It seemed that in the heat of those cellars, as in a Turkish bath, one could sweat out almost any quantity of drink. Plongeurs know this and count on it. The power of swallowing quarts of wine and then sweating it out before it can do much damage is one of the compensations of their life.